Last night, Donald Trump delivered his first, and perhaps only, primetime address of the Iran war. But it hides how the Iran war has created an utterly bizarre situation for the rest of U.S. domestic politics. So my plan for today is to discuss what Trump was attempting to do with the speech. Then we will touch on some important recurring topics on this channel in a manner that tries to present a coherent narrative for the overall political situation that we find ourselves in. I will start by discussing the disconnect between the military coverage and political coverage of the war, and how it is further clouding what U.S. national security-minded folks ought to think of it. Then, we will examine the political fallout for the 2028 presidential race and how something fascinating is happening involving J.D. Vance. Finally, I will give an update on the NATO situation and how Trump, saying nothing about the alliance in the speech, actually says quite a bit. Trump's address began with praise for the crew behind the Artemis 2 launch, which will soon bring humans the furthest from Earth that they have ever been.
Congratulating the team at NASA and our brave astronauts on the successful launch of Artemis 2. It was quite something. It will be traveling further than any manned rocket has ever flown and will very substantially pass the moon, go around it, and come back home from a distance that has never been done before. It's amazing.
In a world full of chaos, it was nice to spend an hour yesterday watching something fun. It has been a while. Anyway, heading into the speech, most of the speculation was that Trump would lay out a clear plan for how to bring the Iran war to a close, with perhaps some explicit threats to NATO to cap off the last few days of strained transatlantic relations. In fact, he barely touched on either of those topics. Obviously, we will save the NATO part for later. Regarding an end to the war, I am not sure what useful information anyone expected to come out of that. It takes two to tango, and Trump cannot dictate the terms of a settlement, never mind know when the settlement will be reached, without a cooperative dance partner. Instead, the address centered on Trump making the case for the war more generally, putting aside the standard stretching of claims that you would get in any speech like this. The bulk of the speech was essentially a persuasive argument, the threat that Iran posed to the United States and allies, what needs to be done to reduce the threat, and how the costs that the United States will pay to accomplish the task at hand are worth the potential upside. It may still have lacked a clear bullet point list of the U.S. aims, but it was getting there. Indeed, it is the type of speech that presidents past would have made for weeks or months ahead of the start of the war, similar to what George W. Bush did in the lead-up to the Iraq War. It is the type of speech that Trump should have given during his historically long State of the Union address, delivered just 4 days before the bombs started falling on Iran. Instead, he spent more time talking about U.S. men's hockey.
And I say, no, 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 you're going to win again. You're going to win big. You're going to win bigger than ever. And to prove that point, here with us tonight is a group of winners who just made the entire nation proud. The men's gold medal Olympic hockey team. Come on in.
In effect, Trump is trying to play catch-up, having made political errors in January and February that set the stage for the Iran war to be the least popular start of a war in U.S. polling history. Now, in our politically polarized world, it is doubtful that a persuasion campaign would have changed the minds of the Democratic base. But there still is a large pool of independents in the United States, and they have mostly sided with Democrats regarding the war. However, in terms of shifting opinions now, I suspect that the ship has sailed here. Democrats and independents will not be persuaded by a comprehensive narrative that tries to justify the war at this point. I also doubt that many Democrats will change their minds regardless of how the war ends, even if the Iranian regime falls and a more Western-friendly government takes its place. It is telling that the social media landscape often treats statements from the Iranian government as gospel, even though every leader throughout time should be subject to our say versus do warning. Perhaps positive war outcomes will move the needle for independence, but even then, I would not expect massive effects. The lack of a coherent narrative entering the war has caused downstream effects on media coverage of the battle, which has in turn negatively distorted the pursuit of the war. I mentioned before that the primary things American voters are thinking about when it comes to Iran are not the military situation and corresponding effects, but the economic effects, namely changes to gas prices and dips in the stock market. This has created an interesting situation where the Pentagon and State Department are tuning their strategies according to the market's reactions and less in response to the military situation compared to a more standard war. The clearest consequences of this policy are the various waivers that the United States has placed on otherwise sanctioned oil, including Iran's own oil. The theory inside of the administration is that you cannot continue the war if gas prices remain elevated. So it is okay to essentially take actions that eventually result in more money handed over to Iran. All of that cash matters little in the long run if the government is blown away. I can see a world where that works, but it also means that the Trump administration is turning a high-leverage situation into an even higher leverage situation. If the war goes poorly, then the downstream consequences of all of those weird economic policies will be magnified. Well, the media has correspondingly focused on those news items. What the average American is therefore not fully grasping are the military consequences of the war. And with very few fatalities, it is easy for those consequences to remain hidden. Yes, you will get snippets of how the war affects Russia in the short term and China in the long term. So your average voter is not oblivious. But the lack of major media outlets focusing on the military side of things is causing problems even for people like us, who are more concerned about the bigger geopolitical picture. You do not need me to tell you again that every weapon fired on Iran is a weapon that cannot deter China later. But you and I both need to have a better sense of just how many weapons have been fired to know the extent of the problem and weigh the risks against the possible benefits that may come out of Iran. For example, let's look at the Tomahawk, considering that there is endless B-roll of those being fired during the war. I could cite some ballpark figures for what is happening with them. The United States has exhausted something like 900 Tomahawks over a month. That may be 20% or more of the US stockpile. The good news for the White House is that it is unlikely that the United States will need to use many more, because you no longer need to rely on them when you have air superiority. You can switch to JDAMs, which are cheaper, plus the Pentagon effectively has an endless supply of them. However, the United States has only been procuring 90 new Tomahawks each year, though the Pentagon believes that production lines could expand to more than 2,000 annually without too much strain. And that is basically what I can tell you about that, with a major caveat that I would not trust any of those numbers. A lot of that is speculation coming from people like me, who are informed about the general situation but not privy to private facts. If we really wanted reliable information here, we would need the larger media outlets to focus their investigative reporting efforts in that direction. And they do, to some extent, which is part of how I could give those figures. But they are not investing heavily in that side of the story because it is not the side that Americans care about. And fair enough, affordability is a major issue, and it has a clear impact on Americans' daily lives right now. It is just troubling that a critical national security issue remains underreported, in large part due to how the Trump administration pursued this war and what yesterday's primetime address was supposed to be undoing. Meanwhile, the war's political ramifications inside of the Beltway have been astonishing. Since the start of Trump's second term, JD Vance has been the prediction market favorite for winning the 2028 presidential election. This was less a reflection of the market's belief that Republicans were in good shape for 2028 and more, that he had effectively boxed out other potential Republican candidates. Even if your party is less than 50% likely to win the election, your own personal odds may be good if it is close to certain that you will win your party's nomination. As a result, JD Vance's odds to become president peaked at 30.5% on September 30th, 2025. However, the start of 2026 was rough for Vance, again less of a reflection on him and more about the Republican Party in general. Even if the Republican Party as a whole faced structural challenges, Vance's near certainty as a nominee elevated his individual standing in prediction markets and political forecasts. However, the political landscape is rarely static. As 2026 began, conditions shifted in ways that proved unfavorable for Vance. Importantly, this downturn was not solely, or even primarily, a reflection of his personal performance or decisions. Instead, it was driven by broader perceptions of the Republican Party's prospects. Political fortunes often move collectively, and when the party brand weakens, even its strongest candidates feel the effects. One early factor contributing to this decline was the visible presence of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, operations in public spaces. While immigration enforcement has long been a politically charged issue, the optics of increased activity on the streets appeared to have a measurable impact on public sentiment, whether due to concerns about civil liberties, community disruption, or broader ideological disagreements. This development contributed to a softening of support for the party, and by extension, for Vance. Yet, if that trend marked the beginning of a downward slide, it was the outbreak of the Iran war that accelerated it dramatically. Foreign policy crises often reshape domestic political dynamics in unpredictable ways. In this case, the conflict introduced new uncertainties, heightened tensions, and shifted voter priorities. The war's economic implications, particularly its effects on energy markets and global stability, added further complexity. As a result, Vance's odds began to decline more sharply. By February 27th, his probability had fallen to 23.1%, a significant drop from its earlier peak. And the trend did not stop there. As we move forward to the present moment, Vance is no longer considered the most likely next president of the United States. That distinction now belongs to Gavin Newsom, who holds a slight edge with odds of 19.2% compared to Vance's 19.0%. While the margin is narrow, the symbolic significance is substantial. Vance has moved from clear frontrunner to being narrowly outpaced by a rival from the opposing party. This shift reflects the convergence of two major forces. The first is a growing consensus among observers and prediction markets that Republicans face an uphill battle in the 2028 election cycle. Whether due to demographic trends, policy positioning, or the cumulative effects of recent events, the party is increasingly seen as operating from a position of disadvantage. This perception naturally depresses the odds of any Republican candidate, regardless of their individual strengths. The second factor is more internal, a rising expectation that Marco Rubio will mount a serious challenge to Vance for the Republican nomination. Primary contests can be highly consequential, not only because they determine the nominee, but also because they can reshape the candidate's public image. A competitive and potentially contentious primary can leave lasting marks, draining resources, exposing vulnerabilities, and creating divisions within the party. Rubio's trajectory illustrates this dynamic. At the outset of the Iran war, his odds stood at 9.0%. Since then, they have risen to 11.5%, though not without fluctuation. Notably, he reached a peak of 16.8% on March 11th before declining somewhat in the weeks that followed. This pattern suggests that while Rubio has gained ground, his fortunes remain tied to the broader environment affecting the Republican Party. The recent dip in Rubio's numbers, like Vance's, appears less about his individual performance and more about the overall perception of the party. When the party struggles, even rising figures within it face headwinds. At the same time, the mere possibility of a competitive primary introduces additional uncertainty for Vance. Even if he ultimately prevails, the process of defeating Rubio could leave him politically weakened. This is a critical point. Winning a primary is not just about securing delegates. It is also about maintaining electability. A bruising contest can result in what might be called a political black eye, a set of negative impressions or unresolved tensions that carry over into the general election. Voters who supported the rival candidate may feel less enthusiastic, while opponents gain new lines of attack based on the primary's conflicts. For these reasons, Rubio remains a figure to watch closely in the coming months. The next 7 months in particular could prove decisive. One key indicator will be the outcome of the 2026 midterm elections. If those elections result in a strong performance for Democrats, a so-called blue wave, the implications for Republican strategy in 2028 will be profound. In such a scenario, a potential resignation by Rubio from his current position would send a powerful signal about his intentions. It would suggest a full commitment to a presidential run and could reshape the internal dynamics of the Republican Party. Moreover, such a move would likely have international repercussions. European leaders, for example, have shown a preference for working with Rubio compared to other figures associated with the Trump administration. His candidacy could therefore influence not only domestic politics, but also transatlantic relations. This brings us to the broader geopolitical context, particularly the evolving situation within NATO. Earlier in the week, tensions escalated when France and Spain closed their airspaces to U.S. aircraft en route to the Gulf. This decision was more than a logistical inconvenience. It was a symbolic gesture reflecting deeper disagreements over policy and priorities. In response, members of the administration began discussing how such actions might compel the United States to reconsider its role in NATO. Speculation quickly followed, with some suggesting that President Trump might use his upcoming primetime address to issue an ultimatum to the alliance. The idea of a dramatic Ghoshna, perhaps even a threat to withdraw from NATO, captured the attention of analysts and observers. However, the address itself proved far more restrained. Rather than delivering a sweeping ultimatum, Trump offered relatively brief remarks focused on burden sharing. He emphasized that allies who rely on oil shipments from the Gulf should contribute more to ensuring the region's security. While this message underscored ongoing frustrations, it stopped well short of signaling an imminent departure from NATO. To understand why such a departure would be unlikely, or at least counterproductive, it is worth examining the underlying logic. The president's frustration appears to center on issues such as basing rights and access to European airspace, particularly in relation to Spain and France. These are legitimate concerns from a strategic standpoint, as they affect the United States' ability to project power and respond to crises. Yet the proposed solution, leaving NATO, does not align with the problem. If the United States were to withdraw from the alliance, it would likely lose access to some of its existing bases in Europe. While certain countries might seek to maintain bilateral agreements, others could choose to distance themselves. The net effect would be a reduction, not an expansion, of U.S. military presence and flexibility in the region. In other words, the threat to leave NATO would exacerbate the very issues it is meant to address. It would weaken the United States' strategic position while providing little leverage to resolve disputes over basing and airspace. This does not mean that tensions within NATO are insignificant or easily resolved. On the contrary, they are likely to persist and may even intensify. There are, however, alternative approaches that the administration could pursue. For example, it could adopt a more flexible interpretation of Article 5, NATO's Collective Defense Clause. Under such an approach, the United States might provide only limited or symbolic assistance to allies that have been less cooperative. This would allow the administration to signal dissatisfaction without fully abandoning the alliance. Such questions are not entirely hypothetical. Spain, in particular, has faced scrutiny for its defense spending levels, which fall short of the 5% of GDP target that other allies have endorsed. Debates over burden sharing have long been a source of friction within NATO, and they are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. The key takeaway is that NATO politics remain complex and fluid. While dramatic scenarios, such as a U.S. withdrawal, capture headlines, they often overlook the practical constraints and strategic considerations that shape decision-making. In many cases, rhetoric serves as a tool for signaling and negotiation, rather than a prelude to immediate action. In a world where political leaders can make bold statements without necessarily incurring immediate costs, it is important to distinguish between threats and intentions. The possibility of a U.S. departure from NATO may be raised from time to time, but its actual implementation would involve significant trade-offs that make it unlikely. Stepping back, several broader conclusions emerge from this analysis. First, political fortunes are deeply interconnected. The trajectory of individual candidates like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio cannot be understood in isolation from the broader dynamics affecting their party. Second, external events, such as international conflicts, can have profound and often unpredictable effects on domestic politics. Third, internal party competition plays a crucial role in shaping electoral outcomes. A strong primary challenge can both energize and weaken a candidate, depending on how it unfolds. Finally, geopolitical considerations remain central to political discourse, influencing not only policy decisions, but also electoral calculations. As for the present moment, the landscape remains highly uncertain. Vance's position has weakened, but he remains a significant contender. Newsom has taken a narrow lead, but the margin is far from decisive. Rubio's rise adds another layer of complexity, and the outcome of the 2026 midterms could shift the balance once again. In short, the race for 2028 is still in its early stages, and much can change in the months and years ahead. Observers would do well to keep an eye on both domestic and international developments, as well as the evolving dynamics within each party. To summarize the key takeaways, Trump's recent primetime address, while less dramatic than anticipated, may have been more effective had it been delivered earlier. The economic dimensions of the Iran war are shaping both strategy and perception, sometimes obscuring its broader geopolitical implications. J.D. Vance faces a challenging path forward amid shifting party dynamics and rising competition. And despite current tensions, the idea of the United States leaving NATO remains unlikely, as it would create more problems than it solves. With that, it may be a good moment to step away from the intensity of political analysis. A long walk, perhaps with a podcast, or a thoughtful discussion in the background can offer a welcome reset. After all, in a rapidly changing world, maintaining perspective is just as important as staying informed.